because the Aces weren't able to be with us. But no, seriously, we all lament not having the opportunity to hear the Kent Roosevelt Aces choir as we have for so many years. But a year like the one we've had, who's surprised? So today, my fellow Rotarians, you get the unexpected surprise of hearing all about my quarantine project. No, I'm not building a boat like Tom Hatch, and no, this isn't about my trials and tribulations and ultimate triumph in cleaning my children's playroom. I started a project back in March that I began turning into a potential presentation in May. COVID and closings hit us here in March, and like everyone else, I was sort of shell-shocked. None of us had had to face these kinds of challenges before, but it got me thinking about those who had, those who lived through the flu pandemic that began in force in 1918. One of those people would have been my great-grandfather, Paul Davy. He fought in World War I and was in grave danger of being taken by the flu while in Europe. And my middle name is Paul for him. What I wouldn't give to have a conversation with him now. That got me thinking about life in 1920. 100 years ago, because it's a nice round number compared to wondering about life 102 years ago. But also this was and is the much anticipated 100-year anniversary of our Rotary Club, which my great-grandfather Paul was a proud member of. So first, let me set the stage. January 1, 1920. Just stop and imagine with me for a moment. The Great War, World War I, had just finished only a little over a year ago in November of 1918. The world was still dealing with the flu pandemic that had started nearly 2 years earlier and had claimed tens of millions of lives around the globe. The temperance movement was making a major push across the United States, and the Volstead Act, passed a few months ago, would be enacted in just a couple of weeks, establishing the prohibition of alcohol. Women can't vote, but that will change by the end of the year. Life expectancy is below the age of 55 for men and women. Only 1% of homes in the United States had both electricity and indoor plumbing. Gas cost about 25 cents a gallon and bread about 12 cents a loaf. There was no commercial radio, so the source of news, entertainment, gossip, and nonsense alike were the newspapers. The Kent Tribune was a weekly newspaper that covered all of those things, and my quarantine project was going through each weekly edition of the 1920 Tribune, and though I admit I did not read every printed word, I did what I hope was a good enough investigative skim to get an idea of what the major events and news of the year was. So here now, I will channel my best David Dix as I review the year 1920 in Kent, Ohio, as reported by the Kent Tribune. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to assume everyone can see it unless you object. January 1, 1920, it came upon a midnight clear, sang the carolers in a Kent church as Christmas neared. Then hold-up men's shot came to their ears, and a passing stranger, robbed, was found lying in the street. The story was about Alfred Cobb, age 22, of Jamestown, New York, who was traveling to Zanesville to see a sweetheart with a transfer at Kent. He was stopped by two other men, held up and shot in the chest. Boys that were caroling at the Christ Episcopal Church heard the shot and saw the men flee. Dr. Brown attended to him, and Carlin's ambulance took him to the hospital in Ravenna, where it was said he would recover. Another man, Ben Lennon of Kent, was also held up that night by the same men, but was not shot. We see a story about celebrating booze leaving. The night of January 15th would be watch night for the WCTU in Kent to welcome the new Prohibition era. Prohibition was passed in late 1919 and would go into effect on January 17th. We also see in each edition, there was always the groceries listed. You'll see on the far right, coffee, about 50 cents a pound, among other things. Some new officials were sworn in, Mayor Frank Schmeidel and new Vice Mayor, Mr. H.E. Steele. Top law dog was this well-mustached man, Marshall Kreitz. We'll hear more about him to come. Evangeline, starring Miriam Cooper, was playing over at the Princess. Interestingly, this was and is a lost film, no known record of it. January 15th, big news all month was the Knights of Columbus minstrel show, an unfortunate sign of the times. Kent's post office went from second to first class, a sign of the phenomenal growth of the past few years. To be first class, a post office had to do more than $40,000 of business in a year. A bull escaped in the Erie yards. Two men spent most of the day chasing it. Here we see a familiar thing: stay home, avoid the flu. Still dealing with it. The headline: two stills and many gallons of illicit liquor found in a raid heavy. Fines are assessed. And kind of in the nonsense section of the paper, there was always silly things throughout the year. And here in the bottom middle, that man Brian certainly does keep sticking around. February, deaths were really the major headline. Every front page was really covered with many deaths. Most editions having at least 10. One of them had at least 17 on the front page alone. Many of them attributed to the flu. One stepped on a nail. A Civil War veteran passed. Lincoln Day was big news as Congressman Fess was set to speak. Lincoln Day, I knew nothing about. It's the big Republican fundraising event before the primary. The Democrat version is Jefferson Jackson Day. Who knew? Male and Female, starring Gloria Swanson and Thomas Meighan, playing at the Kent Opera House. It's a 1919 silent film adventure drama. It was Paramount Pictures' biggest hit of 1919. In March, a story about the reorganization of the Erie Railroad was in the paper. Mason Tire and Rubber taking over the Cleveland-based Mason Cotton Fabrics Company in a large land deal involving what is now the Longtoy neighborhood. Deaths, unfortunately, continued to make news. The Twin Lakes Development Project, a group called the Twin Lakes Company, purchases 305 acres of land and 90 acres of water from the Merrill family. Directors of the company included Roy Smith, M.L. Davey, J.W. Salter, and Dr. W.B. Andrews. A dam controversy: high water rushing through a weakening dam in Kent. The B&O Railroad fellas laid their own plans to dynamite the dam, but Kent law officials, including our beloved, well-mustached Marshall Kreitz, stood guard through the night, and that would lead to increased talks to have the dam repaired and ultimately rebuilt. March ended with a beloved citizen and Civil War veteran, George Furry, passing away. News of a new automobile company moving to Kent, and the Kent school superintendent making the natural leap from school superintendent to lumber company president. We're keeping an eye on you, George Joseph. Also published was a letter from Ada Longcoy telling of her and her husband's travels and exploits on the West Coast, as well as a story by Jimmy Tolley in which he effuses his love for the state of California. Tolley was an American writer of some fame who had lived in Kent just a few years earlier and moved to California. April began with the announcement that the Talmart Motor Company would manufacture a fast-going light truck in the former Seneca chain plant. The future was not bright for the Talmart truck. The company would close after just 2 years. More proliferation of deaths and minstrel shows in April. Tragedy struck when young Catherine Getz was struck by a car and killed instantly. She was 13. And another story here about the village of Twin Lakes, which claimed it would soon have its own churches, stores, and movies. Not quite the way it went. Kent 25 years ago was a column that appeared roughly every month in the Kent Tribune. Not sure where they got their stats, but over here you see a small blurb claim that 1/4 of people born die before 6, and 1 in 100 would make it to 65. And Dr. Edwards olive tablets, incredible things that were advertised in the paper. Quick relief from constipation as well as bad breath. It really could cure everything. And over here in the kind of the silly, like the Twitter of its time, Mr. and Mrs. Guy Legg, you can kind of see here interesting stories and bits. Mr. Walls was also elected superintendent of the Kent City Schools at that paper. April ended with more news from the rapidly growing Mason Tire and Rubber Company. Senator Warren Harding carrying Ohio in the primary, and Kent voters approving bonds for the construction of a new high school, which would become what is now Davie Elementary. Also announced was the opening of an aviation field to be west of Kent, we all know as the Kent State University Airport. And be better looking, take olive tablets, have color in your cheeks. Really incredible things, the olive tablets. May begins. Teachers for the coming year announced some capacities not yet filled at the high school. A teacher of science, domestic science teacher, supervisor of drawing, and instructor in physical training. And again, Dr. Edwards olive tablets also cure upset stomach. A tragic story of a young girl passing after suffering terrible burns was news. Kent State Normal School reported that 205 new students had entered for that term, bringing enrollment to 445, an increase of 85% for spring term. Big news in May was that the Kent State Normal School president, McGilvery, attending a national conference in Washington, D.C., called by President Wilson. Also, the Board of Trade announced they would help residents haul away their, quote, tin cans and unsightly things in an effort to improve town aesthetics. In the society and club section, again, kind of like the Twitter, we see that Gus Heckman of Meadville spent Sunday in Kent. The May 20th edition featured the headline, Help Granddad Ride the Goat, with no article or context. And in the same edition, there was news that the Haymaker heirs sold their 200-acre farm and East Twin Lake water holdings to Roy Smith and Company. Speaking of haymakers, the month ended with an article about Mr. and Mrs. Arvin Haymaker celebrating 50 years of marriage, and a nice picture and story of the new hotel in downtown that was nearing completion. We also see reports from the local baseball and summer season at Brady Lake is in full swing. Commencement in early June at both Kent High School and Kent State Normal School was overshadowed by a major explosion at the Mason Tire and Rubber Factory. 2 men were killed initially and another 30 were injured when a fire reached a 15,000-gallon Benzol tank. Silent film Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde played at the Princess Theater, but the big explosion remained heavy in the news as additional people died from injuries. Ohioan Warren Harding and running mate Calvin Coolidge were named to the Republican ticket at the convention in Chicago. Kent's population was announced as 7,070, and June saw a number of crimes, and there was a cry for more law enforcement help, which was being handled by just one ubiquitous individual, our beloved Marshall Kreitz. Lake Brady Park was booming. Outrage about a bridge project over Breakneck Creek between Kent and Ravenna taking so long. And more silliness in the Twitter section. Seen John Musson's garden yet? No? Then you've missed a pretty sight. As we move into July, Dr. Albert Shelton, here's a national story, a missionary in China kidnapped by bandits. The story was written for the Kent Tribune by a man named Elliot Osgood, former Kent man who was traveling with a famous Chicago Tribune correspondent, Fred Smith, who took it upon himself to find and free Shelton. It was a wild story where Smith almost dies, gives away his 6 kids, but does in fact find and free Dr. Albert Shelton. The paper touts in the top left here that Ohio provides the nation with presidents. Harding, of course, wins in the fall and is the last Ohio president, so it probably shouldn't have boasted. At the Democratic National Convention in San Francisco, Ohio Governor James Cox was made the nominee. And an interesting poem that I'm not going to read by Jim Tolley for the Kent Tribune. And a small brag on my great-grandfather, Paul Davey, who hit a triple in the 9th to lift the Army-Navy Union squad to a 1-0 win over the Mason Tire squad. Here's what Kent people do in the summer, and a nice mention of longtime Rotarian and famous Kent man, Dr. Bobby Dumm, who was only 2 1/2 years old at the time. The paper notes he made a flight over Twin Lakes and is Kent's youngest aviator. We also see a story about the Kent Universalist Church having its steeple burned down when lightning struck it. And Portage County, it was reported, had 4,020 autos. Interesting story on the Kent Federation of Women's Clubs maintaining a public health center in Kent. This is in August now. Their focus was primarily on the health and well-being of children. Big news in early August was the Democrat primary that saw Kent's own Martin L. Davey win his 2nd nomination to the U.S. House of Representatives. And the sad story of a young man who lost a finger was ultimately taken to the hospital in the Bistler ambulance, where he died of lockjaw, or basically tetanus. Most popular girl contest. This was a marketing ploy of a new hotel. I never did find out who won. We see here that an Akron man shimmied at Lake Brady Park and had to be arrested when he refused to cease the objectionable dance. Another 25 years ago, featuring an area father and son being murdered, George Reddick dropped dead. That's all it said. Kent lost to Aurora 11-10, no sports specified, so I assume baseball, as well as a few area drownings at Brady and Silver Lake. Plans for the new high school were approved. The structure is to be one of the most modern in the country, the paper writes. Vaccination certificates were required by the schools as children returned that fall. Interesting for a few reasons here. Another Kent 25 years ago talks about the National Women's Suffrage Convention at Lake Brady Park. Appears that Susan B. Anthony was set to speak and attend, but she was too ill. Carrie Chapman Catt, a prominent national figure in her own right in the suffrage movement, did attend and speak. Pretty cool. Just 6 days earlier, the 19th Amendment was ratified, but there was zero mention of this in the local paper, aside from things such as the New York Herald's poem in the top right. Mary has a little vote, a ballot white as snow, and what she plans to do with it, the bosses do not know. Zero mention of the fact that women now have the right to vote. September sees the much anticipated opening of the new hotel, which the Tribune called one of the finest civic improvements ever attempted here. School was set to begin, but the DePeister building was not yet complete, and as a result, Kent students had a part-time schedule at other school buildings, Central and Riverside. Due to community growth, Kent and Franklin Township went from 6 precincts to 14. The Normal College announced a new department for the training of teachers for, quote, defective children, and this is interesting, the Kent Board of Education approved night courses for men working during the day. Football season begins with reports from the local squads. Heading into October, here we see the first mention of the new Kent Rotary Club. They met in the evening on Monday, October 4th at the new Franklin Hotel and made W.A. Walls chairman and A.B. Babbitt secretary as temporary officers. Local fans were happy to have the Cleveland Indians in the World Series this fall. Kent fans were reported to be packing North Water Street to, quote, watch the games, as presented in front of Eddie Holden's, where the game came in by wire and announced to the crowd. Fun fact, they played all 7 games, with the Tribe winning 5 games to win it all. So that 7th game couldn't have been very competitive. The nation was drawing near to the national election, and at least in Kent, it was Harding with a sizable lead in the straw polls. We also see where Kent people would vote, the best being Precinct J, which was, quote, someplace on William Street. In social news, Major Smith gave an illustrated talk on a better planned system for Kent to the Federation of Women's Clubs, he of Major's Lane fame. We begin gearing up for Armistice Day, led by the local Army and Navy Union. There was an attempted jailbreak at the county jail, thankfully outside of Marshal Kreitz's jurisdiction, when a gang was caught trying to dig out. The sheriff loaded them up to take them to the Mansfield Reformatory, made famous, of course, by the 1994 Shawshank Redemption, but they assaulted the sheriff near Lodi and tried to get away again, but Sheriff Stevens and Deputy McMillan successfully rounded them up. And here's a blurb from the H.C. Longcoy Grocery, who wrote that 60 days ago they thought that few Kent people enjoyed lamb and mutton, but lately many would use it at the right price. Ohio Governor Cox and Democratic presidential candidate makes one last stop in Kent ahead of the election that we know goes poorly for him. It was announced in the paper that Rotary Club officers would be installed on November 10th, followed by a banquet at the Franklin Hotel with officers of W.A. Walls as president, Roy Smith as vice president, A.B. Babbitt as secretary treasurer, C.F. Gressard as sergeant at arms, and directors Dr. Dumm, D.M. Mason, J.S. Green, F.B. Bryant, and A.N. Lawson. November starts with the election that sees Harding win over Cox. If I Were King, starring William Farnham, was playing at the Princess, while over at the Opera House, you could get a laugh watching Fatty Arbuckle in the Roundup. Thursday, November 11th, 1920, Armistice Day, to celebrate the end of the Great War just 2 years earlier. Kent had a number of veterans, including a handful that would become members of the Kent Rotary Club. A few stories stick out in this edition. One was the return of the body of Private Claude Davis the previous Sunday evening on Erie Train 7, so he could be laid to rest in Standing Rock Cemetery. He gave his life in the Argonne Offensive. The Argonne Offensive was the final Allied offensive of World War I, from late September to November 11th, just 2 years earlier, and his body was just then being returned. You also see a picture there of an older gentleman named M.A. Ricksecker, who had passed away earlier that week at age 81. He was a Civil War veteran and worked the Atlantic and Great Western Railroad between Kent and Galleon for many years. Another thing that stuck out to me was over here on the left where it says Gertrude Falkenhagen, great name, a nurse who served overseas at Base Hospital 65, and another woman were being enrolled as members of the Army and Navy Union, which I thought was pretty cool. This sent me down a quick little Google rabbit hole when I decided to Google Base 65 Hospital in France, and I found a picture on the far left here of Gertrude Falkenhagen and all the other women who were the healthcare providers. And here's a picture of the base in the bottom. Just got me thinking to how important these healthcare workers were at the time, treating both flu patients and people who had been injured in the war, and just got me thinking to now how important healthcare workers are. So thank a healthcare worker today. Back to Kent. 9-acre site was announced for the new Kent High School. I found it interesting that just a few months earlier, the article says the Board of Education was considering a site on South Water Street, but after a national expert reviewed the site and plans for that site quite negatively, the board searched for an alternative. Roy Smith told the board that if he had had any suitable land for the purpose of building a new school, he would happily sell it at a fair price. Smith's land, along with property from John Davy, became the new site, later becoming Davy Junior High and now Davy Elementary. Over at the Princess, you could see the famous Tom Mix, the star of many to most early Western films, in The Untamed. Story about major renovations at the Kent National Bank, which we learned about last month from Mark Pruis and our own Doug Fuller. A nice ad for the Kent Auto Service Station tells readers to stop cussing their cars and to bring them in for a good tune-up. And for $1.50, you could enjoy Thanksgiving dinner at the Franklin Hotel, featuring a grape juice cocktail, remember no drinking, celery consomme, turkey, cranberry sauce, candied sweet potatoes, and baked squash for $1.50. Thursday, December 2nd, 1920, and as we all know, this was the very day our club would officially be chartered. The ceremony would be that evening at 6 p.m. at the Franklin Hotel, where District Governor, Sam Squires of Elyria would present the charter. An interesting article on the Kent Development Company, which it states was formed for the general purpose of promoting the general welfare of the city of Kent. Prominent Kent man, Major Smith, was the primary promoter. Here's a nice little clip that I think has held up well over time. Much in little. A baby will make love stronger, days shorter, night longer, bankroll smaller, home happier, clothes shabbier, the past forgotten, and the future worth living for. Still holds true. And also this completely nonsensical quote, Earl McPeak wasn't married, he was just hunting rabbits down near Ericksville. A fatal crash made big news in December when two transit cars collided, ultimately killing 4 and injuring many. The unfortunate event overshadowed the nice report on our club's big night on the 2nd. It was reported that District Governor Squires gave a grand talk on the Rotary spirit as that of friendship and service. Frank Elgin presented a junior Rotarian orchestra of 6 young musicians who were given a standing ovation. The young musicians were Arthur Babbitt, Louise and Esther Getz, Laura Smith, Helen Zingler, and Mildred Elgin. And a silly clip here, again, kind of the Twitter section. Everybody's glad that Uncle Chris Cackler's eyesight is back to normal. Christmas time in 1920, a big paving program was announced for paving Crane Avenue from Water to DePeyster, DePeyster from Crane to Summit, Summit from Franklin Avenue to Morris, and other streets. The Kent Opera House was playing George Melford's Behold, My Wife. Not surprisingly, Melford's first marriage ended a few years later. As the end of the year approached, a fire burned down the Rockwell Company property on East Main Street. The firemen and volunteers were praised for their efforts in keeping the fire contained to just one building in the face of the coldest blizzard of the year and battling frozen hydrants. The following letter was forwarded by the Rotary Club to the chief of the fire department and published in the Tribune. Dear Sir, the Rotary Club of Kent wishes to compliment you and the Kent Volunteer Fire Department upon the very creditable, efficient, and courageous manner in which the battle against the fire which occurred on the morning of December 28th was conducted. We feel this is one of the many instances where creditable work has been done and that this work should not go unrecognized. Will you kindly extend our appreciation to the Cuyahoga Falls Fire Department for the assistance rendered? Sincerely yours, Arthur B. Babbitt, Secretary. It was happily announced that the DePeyster building, which was unable to open in time for the fall, would be open on January 3rd. Here's an ad for the big dance on New Year's night at the Army and Navy Hall. Hopefully nobody shimmied. And news about the most recent Rotary meeting featuring a timely talk on legislation given by Congressman Martin L. Davey. Davey also extended an invitation to the members and ladies to attend a dinner and dance at the Franklin on January 6th, which was promptly accepted. Some interesting names here on the right. We see a Mr. and Mrs. P.B. Hall, a Mr. and Mrs. Fred M. Fuller of Pittsburgh were holiday guests of Kent relatives, and more. Again, the Twitter of its time. And lastly, on page 4 of the final edition in 1920 was this poem by Cherry Wilson that I will end this presentation on. It's titled, "The Little Old Newspaper from Your Old Hometown." When you're feeling kind of lonesome and the atmosphere is blue, when life's no bed of roses and folks seem down on you, I know what will make you happy and chase away the frown. Read the little old newspaper from your old hometown. You won't laugh about the trifling things the paper has to say, for every line's a message from the old home far away. Even Si's new chicken coop will not provoke a smile, or the great big city dailies lie unopened all the while. Bill's girl has gone to college and Joe's boy is home from France. The Ladies' Aid will hold a social and the Masons give a dance. So you read the local happenings and never miss a line, and 'cause they're all your neighbors, you'll be glad that crops are fine. Then before you know it, you've read it through and through, and all the world seems brighter and life seems good to you. So for a pillow pleasure to chase away the frown, take the little old newspaper from your old hometown. That's the program. Happy holidays, everybody. And remember, help Granddad ride the goat.
That was fabulous, Dave. You missed your calling for Saturday Night Live, no doubt about it. Then we're going to have a responder, and that's going to be Jim Myers.
Well, I loved it. I loved it. David, probably David Dix would like to respond to that too, particularly with your finish. I was amazed, just amazed of how many Rotarians made the paper through that entire presentation. It was fabulous. They were half of those names were our charter members. I also love the fact that you must have zeroed in on the fact that I sold Dr. Edwards olive tablets. They were still in the drugstore within a few years before we closed. Beautiful little, it looked like a little dispenser, green in color with the name Dr. Edwards Olives. You also touched upon all the schools that I went. My kindergarten at DePeyster, the old Union School, which was then called Central School, and Roosevelt High School, which you now call Davie, of course, is the high school I graduated from. So you had a good reason to ask me to respond to this, even though it was a mystery, you said. And a mystery is something that's difficult or impossible to understand or explain. But that was not the case today, because I loved the way you went through the entire series of papers and gleaned out what was probably the most important things, like women voting and certainly prohibition being established. And the fact that the Kent Tribune was the source of all your work there was indeed enjoyable. You did some work on this, and I hope the members appreciate it as much as I do. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you very much, Jim. It was a very enjoyable program, and we're going to end it at that. Hope everyone has a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, and we'll see you in 2021.